Hello and welcome to the second UJ Cloud Debate for 2020. It's also our second cloud debate that's online. We've really been enjoying this format and the interactive participation from you, our viewers. Remember, this debate is your debate, so we encourage you to join us on the chat line and we will come to your questions so that we can have a robust conversation. Today we are looking at post-truth. What is truth? What is communication? How are we communicating? Are we posting the truth or are we living in a post-truth world? As many of you have experienced, COVID-19 is about giving all sorts of information to different people. You walk into a shop and you have to tell them who you are, what your cell phone number is. We live in a world in which news, an app from IKEA, Spotify, Pokemon, and adverts all come from the same place and are driven by the same thing. But what is that? It's the fourth industrial revolution. It's artificial intelligence, virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. And in all this communication, it's really hard to know who is saying what. Are you being spoken to by a person, or is it a chatbot? Is it some teenager half the world away from you who is inventing something that looks like news? Or is it just some algorithm that an AI bot has put together? Many of us are used to a world in which information was stuff that was written down, things that a journalist had fact-checked. Nowadays, we live in a world in which information comes in so many different modalities. Pictures that can be photoshopped. What do we believe? A video that has been doctored, something that looks like the truth, but is actually just made up. Another part of the problem of the world that we live in and our communication today is that it's very unclear sometimes what is the news. Is the news the presenter, or is the news what is actually happening? Is the news people's opinion about what happened or facts about what happened? But who checked those facts? We live in a world in which there is also a darker side to so much of this communication. What about privacy? What about power? What about ethics and trust? Who is manipulating what we see, read, and hear? Is this just a form of entertainment? Or is this about helping us to better understand the world that we live in? All of this is what we're going to investigate this evening, and we would really like you to join in this debate. To help us unpack this very complex world in which we live, and to help us understand communication and information in the world of COVID-19, we have four people on our panel. The first is Professor Ilva Rogni-Gumede. Professor Ilva is the Senior Director at the Division of Internationalization and is also Professor in the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. She is a Senior Research Associate with the Stanhope Center for International Communicative Policy and Research at the London School of Economics. Ilva is a former journalist and has also worked in marketing and PR. She is the current president of the South African Communications and Media Association. Dr. Karabo Sito is a lecturer in the Department of Strategic Communication at the University of Johannesburg. Her research areas of interest include digital and online communication, identity, social representations, as well as teaching and learning. She has worked in digital advertising and public relations for leading award-winning South African agencies and remains actively involved within the digital communications industry and community. She is the co-editor of Connect, Writing for Online Audiences, as well as co-author of several academic published articles. Kerry Sheehan is joining us, and she has over 15 years of experience in government, health, tech, B2C, and B2B sectors, including global brands such as Intercontinental and Microsoft. She has extensive experience leading communications and marketing functions in agencies and in-house settings, and has proven success in developing and implementing artificial intelligence strategies. Kerry is chair of the Global Leading Artificial Intelligence in Public Relations panel, looking at the implications and opportunities for AI in the PR, communications, and marketing industry. And Matthew van der Valk is Executive Creative Director at Geometry South Africa, and he has both a degree in Creative Communications Management and an honours degree in Strategic Brand Communications, cum laude. Matthew has been straddling the lines between creative and strategic brand communications for the last 14 years, having worked with over 140 different brands across a multitude of diverse industry. He has developed countless integrated through-the-line advertising campaigns and innovative marketing strategies that include everything from traditional above-the-line to digital and social media marketing. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to kick off the round of questions, and then we will start to ask our audiences to join us and to share their questions. Karabo, I'd like to start by asking you what you think or how you think 4IR is transforming how we communicate. What is the new normal in PR communications? And I wonder if you want to look at this question both broadly, as I've asked it, but then also within the context of COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think it's been interesting and a privilege to be part of the evolution of the journey of the growth of 4IR. I think if I start back thinking marketing and the debates we're having about how to introduce digital to marketing was maybe about, almost 10 years ago, plus, more than 10 years ago. And at the time, it was an option. It was an optional extra. And switch to today, it's a no-brainer. And for people within industry that understand that, there always used to be this tug of war between above the line, below the line, digital, who leads. And I remember the spaces we used to fight for recognition, for digital communication and digital to lead. And now digital is first. Before any and everything else, it almost becomes the pillar that from which all the other communication happens. And it's been a very interesting evolution to watch, because it hasn't really necessarily emanated from the communication industry itself. It's come as a result of the technology and the demands by the people we speak to, for, and about, and who consume the messages, who've decided how it is they want to consume, where they want to consume, and how much of it they want to consume. So what used to be considered short form video was a 5-minute video. No one will watch a 5-minute video now. Not even me, I won't. And it's transformed a lot, and it's revolutionized a lot. But I think in the same breath, it's also provided many, many opportunities for a lot of organizations and businesses and professionals to reevaluate the value of the industry and the value of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and more than ever, the relationship aspect in terms of the work that we do.
Great, thank you, Karabo. I wonder, Matt, if you want to come in here and talk a little bit about the sort of technologies that you think are cutting edge at the moment. When I was reading your intro, it also struck me that we were talking about below the line and above the line as though they were somehow divided, because it doesn't feel like that anymore. And also, what do you think are some of the things we need to be careful of, or maybe even fearful with this new technology?
Certainly, and I think, thank you, Maria. I think that absolutely these lines have been blurred. And I think that that is fundamentally what this shift in, I guess, this industrial revolution has been. I think that it's, just to kind of preface my point of view, is I think it's less of a revolution than it has been an evolution at revolutionary speeds. I think it's been, in the third industrial revolution, where we were talking a lot about information technologies and how they were evolving processes. Now it's the same thing, just at a much, much more exponential kind of trajectory. So absolutely, I think that these lines are blurred, and I think these lines are blurred not just in terms of how we communicate, but how we live and how we exist. So for me, something that is exceptionally interesting is the Internet of Things. So our connection and our communication is no longer just limited to what we see, between us and a screen. It's how our clothing monitors, how our exercise clothing, for example, will monitor our heart rates, how our smartwatches are integrating into much more than just what they were initially designed for. So I think that it's both a blessing and a curse. Obviously, as we start to get more and more metadata being essentially harvested, I think that that is what essentially creates a bit of a broken telephone effect. And I think that what we need to be cognizant of is making sure that our communication still stays at the forefront of what we're trying to do. Communication in terms of connection and how we connect with each other and the environment in which we live. I think that the systemic nature of how, communication, things, people, and everything, I think, around us is starting to become more and more connected, becomes a lot more interesting as we develop these technologies.
Kerry, I'd like to focus now, taking this conversation a little bit more to the COVID-19, the communication that you've been involved in the UK and with the UK government, and what that's meant for how a society has dealt with a pandemic, both the positive side and the negative side of the kind of communication that is out there and available.
So, sort of in basic terms, sort of layman's terms, obviously the average person, in the street, so to say, real good communication saves lives. And I think that's what, all governments were up against as soon as, oh my gosh, we've got a pandemic on our hands, accelerating, like something we've never witnessed across the world before. And very quickly, in phase one, we did see some really robust messaging coming out from all governments, I think, which is basically, the UK, it was, stay home, save lives, save the NHS. It's no secret, the only way the NHS was saved was by closing everything else. But over 90% of the population adhered to that messaging because it was, very clear, very accurate. There might have been a bit of a scare factor there, but that really worked. And then over sort of the coming weeks and months, as we kind of moved, through the curve, so to say, and then obviously we've just not so long ago hit the second phase where we're starting to look at some of that messaging coming off, is where we've really started to see a lot of the misinformation, of the conspiracy theories coming through. And of course that is aided by the tech, the algorithms that you can actually put together in minutes and seconds now. So I think just picking up on what Matthew's just said, as sort of tech diversifies at lightning speed, artificial intelligence gets better and better at targeting people. We too need to go on that whole upskilling journey ourselves to not only be up with it but be one step ahead. And obviously we are facing an absolute disinformation battle every day now, and I don't think that's going to change, and that is a crisis waiting to happen in itself. So I think whilst technology is fantastic, and obviously most people, like what Karibo's just said, consume things. Their attention spans are down to about 3 seconds now. 5 minutes, it's just no. 3 seconds, if you haven't grabbed them, that's it, they're gone. So it's obviously still, vitally important what we do, but there are dark forces out there, obviously impacting what we do, and obviously that can have serious consequences on the people we want to make aware, inform, try and comply through behaviour change, etc. So I think, technology is accelerating like what we've never seen before. And now coming out of the other side of the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk. Recovery may not be until 2023. Whether that happens, who knows, across the world. We may see some kind of miracles in the months and weeks ahead of ourselves. But even, every company now that's fighting for its survival or trying to diversify for its future, because we're unlikely to go back to how we were before. And that's partly led by the publics, that we do communicate with. Obviously, there's a lot of chatter out there about a green recovery from most countries. And again, all of that will be aided by, the ways that we communicate with people now. And obviously that's new and diversifying, tech, kit. But obviously that comes with a caveat that we just can't forget the people that aren't online either. So I think we've got a bit of a balancing act there.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kerry. Ilva, I want to bring you into the conversation here, because one of the things that Kerry was talking about was how organizations are going to be communicating. And I wonder if you wouldn't like to say a little bit more about the way organizations communicate in the fourth industrial revolution, but also in the COVID and post-COVID environment.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question, Prof. Maria. I think that it's really, really interesting, because what Karabo touches upon, Matthew as well and Kerry as well, is about communications and involving people. So let us take a step and go beyond the technology. And Karabo, Matthew talked about technology first, our fascination with technology, and rightfully so. But maybe we're moving sort of a need to move beyond that kind of fascination with technology and that little bit sort of a techno-determinism, if you wish, to combat some of the things that Kerry talked about as well in terms of disinformation and so on. We need to understand the technology that feeds those things. But I think it is about people. And for organizations, particularly around the COVID pandemic, I mean, as Kerry rightfully points out, right communication can save lives. And this is what organizations struggles with as well. And I think that traditionally, organizational communications is about relationships, communications with stakeholders, external, internal, creating relationships. It's about branding, creating an image and so on as well towards both internal and external stakeholders. But it is about forming relationships and reaching out. And with 4IR and the new technology that we have at our disposal, that has become even more important. And this idea of using and fostering 21st century skills, such as that talks to collaboration, fostering creativity, co-creation, and so on. And that needs to be centered or to be at the center of how we communicate as well. So I think that in terms of what organizations should do is to recognize that in 4IR, communications will be about moving beyond the technology, knowing that technology is but a tool, and thinking about then how one can create sort of be creative, thinking innovatively about technology or how technology can aid communication. And I think that what's really important here is diversity. And we need to understand that we live in a very interconnected world, and the pandemic has showed us this for sure. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand diversity and how diversity feeds innovation, creativity, and how that can aid our communication as well. And I think that here it's really important that we understand that non-hierarchical organization and non-hierarchical communication is the communication that succeeds better than these kind of top-down approaches. So we have to have lateral and co-creative and collaborative communication even in our organizations. And communication that is emphatic, that actually takes listening into account and listening to stakeholders. And I think that when we talk about communication, whether it's government communication or organizational communication around COVID, it has been really important to be center emphatic communication in organizational structures as well, and actually have a communication approach that listens to the employees, for example, within an organization, and understands what their needs are for them to understand safety, and what the organization do to aid them in both with safety and sort of business continuity in their portfolios and so on.
Fascinating. For those of you who are watching, please do join in the conversation. Send your questions to any one of the panelists or generally to the whole panel. We are talking about communication, power and communication, the dark side of communication. How do we know when something is fake news or the truth that we really need to be taking seriously in order to, for example, save lives? Karabo, you are at the coalface of lecturing in this COVID environment. And I wonder what would be some of the things around communication that you think higher institutions of learning need to be aware of. How, for example, do we pick up on what Ilva was saying and as an institution listen to our students and have that as a way of communicating in this very challenging environment?
So I had a thing in preparation for the discussion, and I thought back to the experience we've had because UJ switched to online teaching from the 20th of April, and now we're in an exam period. It's been tough. We can see it. And for the very first time, I think each and every single institution is finally confronted with wondering about what happens to the student beyond the gates. We've always provided technology, facilities, and support on campus, but we've never wondered, once the student swipes out the gate, where do they go? What kind of environment are they working in? What kind of connectivity, if any at all, do they have? What kind of community are they going into? Within the home, do they have some sort of not just affective support, but academic support as well? And this period has, I think, for the first time made us, it's ironic that it's the tools that have made us think about the human on the other side. That's really irony, is for the very first time it's taken a global pandemic to think about the person receiving whatever piece of communication on the other side. Am I being clear? Will that person receive this message? So if we're packaging literature and content for lectures, is it fair for me to send a file that's a certain size? What kind of devices and tools are students using? What kind of access do they have? Is it fair for me to have an expectation that they should be online at a certain time? Or does it become about the flexibility of being able to participate within your means without, and this was the biggest adage from government, from institutions as well, and across the board, even within the academia, that we should strive to not leave students behind. But it actually requires us to think about the student much more holistically than just that individual who comes in on campus is a number. There are certain things that they need to fulfill to be able to, get through, enjoy, and also to think about what is the value of a higher education experience now more than ever when they're sitting at home, in terms of the skills development as well as the competence, particularly for communication students, who I look at in terms of, what are we teaching them? And this almost becomes a real living case study of the implementation and application of the work we're teaching them as well.
Thank you so much. Kerry has a question around the POPI Act, which I want to ask you about, Matthew, because it picks up on what Karabo has been saying about us understanding the people that we share our world with. And Kerry asks, how will the POPI Act influence 4IR in communications in a time of COVID-19 and beyond as well, on the web? And how do we keep information safe?
I've just got a lot of thoughts coming from what Karaba just said, around, you know, how much do you share? Where do you share? What does that mean in terms of the chasm of privilege? So how much you know about different individuals as you go into organizations, your personal information, not just in terms of how you think, what your opinions are, your likes, dislikes, all of those kinds of things, but really your health, your wellness, your relative privilege, your discrimination. There's so many aspects to it that I think makes it so much more human. And I think that when we're talking specifically around this industrial revolution that we have in our hands, and really how I guess misinformation has become the preceding pandemic of our world, and how that information, whether it be truthful or not, starts to translate. So, for example, you know, we have this protection of our personal information. However, how much of that is truthful? And in a world where truth matters less than popular opinion, how do we start to navigate, I guess, that darkness, which is in the absence of understanding what this metadata looks like? How do we start to unpack that? So I guess it's a question on a question, but it's one that I think is unanswered as of yet.
And I think that's one of the reasons why this debate is so important, because it's about asking these questions and unpacking the questions together. Gugulethu has a question, I think, for you, Kerry, which is, you talk about communication as saving lives, and I fully agree with what you've been saying, especially as somebody who's been following the news in the UK quite closely. But what would you say about China and its apparent underrepresentation of the extent of the coronavirus and the impact that has had, and perhaps it's very late communicating of the coronavirus?
So obviously the issue with China is, as we're all aware, it's a closed state. So whether they have or haven't underreported, I don't think I can make judgment on that, although that is the common consensus out there. Obviously that brings into question ethics when other countries across the world have taken the decision to, you know, openly report the exact numbers of deaths, of cases, of people being tested, etc., subject to some of the recalibration needed in those data reporting systems. I do know that in China it was quite interesting, because obviously it's very state controlled, so it's one-way broadcast from the government and the public authorities. At the height of the pandemic there, sort of January, February time, you know, just before, you know, the COVID-19 took off, you know, in other countries across the world, the government actually took the decision to shut down WeChat. Obviously, across other countries, we tend to use WhatsApp a bit more, but the government actually closed off WeChat to try and deal with all of the chatter and stop some of the misinformation, you know, circulating there. It has been turned back on since, but obviously, you know, if we had that approach in other countries, you know, which do have democratic rights to information, etc., then obviously we would have created another issue elsewhere against, you know, people's freedom of speech, data privacy, and all of those kind of things. So obviously, you know, we're getting into the politics here, which obviously we can't do. But obviously, as communicators, you know, we all take, you know, oaths of ethics, and that is for open and transparent communication at all levels. We actively advise chief execs, the boardrooms, to be open and transparent. We absolutely advise, you know, even down to artificial intelligence, you know, you need to have full transparency over people's data. What is it being used for? We do have data protection laws, you know, the general data protection regulation that covers the UK and Europe. We have equivalents in the States and other countries, which do give people a bit more protection as to what they're communicating over and with, because they have to opt in. So regards to China, I don't think we can say whether it's right or wrong, because that is a bit of a political question. But in relation to the fourth industrial revolution, I think what we are seeing with the communications function, with communications practitioners, we absolutely have to be guardians of the truth. You know, that is a role that we are absolutely in. And if you start to break it down with ethics, you know, Matt was saying, you know, a real big pandemic out there is the amount of misinformation and disinformation there, and how it snowballs, then that makes our roles, you know, even tougher. But the call is stronger for open and transparent communications. And we're seeing that accelerated now, obviously, as we get into the latter stages of the pandemic, and that's where technology can help us, of course. But I think we're in real danger here if we don't kind of pull ourselves back, because obviously, you know, it's well known, trust in institutions are down. We've got a bigger problem on our hands. Trust in the media is down. But that gives a real opportunity to communicators to actually guide and advise organisations, brands, businesses, to be that single source of truth, and actually, you know, use your channels or your tech or however you're communicating with people, communicate with them directly. You know, of course, you know, media is nice to have nowadays, but it's not always an essential. For example, in the UK, local regional media is pretty much dead due to advertising revenues being down. The media is diversifying. We're seeing a lot of AI generated content in the media, automated content. The national media in the UK and States are fighting a battle to remain alive. But again, I think that's where we diversify, and we become our own news broadcasters. You know, we put in place our own platforms for communicating directly with people. We utilise the other channels as and when we can. I think we've got a vital role to play. It's a huge role. There are all of these dark forces coming at us. I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. If anything, you know, as more people get to learn how to do these things and work on these things, whether it's in their bedroom or on mass scale farms that we hear that come out of places, you know, like China and probably other places across the world. We absolutely have to be guardians of the truth now, and that starts with, you know, ethics as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kerry. Ilva, I'd like to ask you to build on this question of ethics, power, and who are the gatekeepers? That's a question that's been coming up in the chat. So who are the gatekeepers of information? And how do we know that these gatekeepers are actually feeding us information that is reliable?
Yeah, I think, and that goes back a little bit to something I wanted to add to the earlier question that Kerry asked as well, what happens with POPI, for example, and the Protection of Personal Information Act and so on. And I think that it's interesting because now we also need to realize that we are operating under sort of the National Disaster Act, which gives then government other freedoms than they normally wouldn't have. So that's one side to it. And I think that comes back then to this idea, who are the ultimate gatekeepers as well in this game. I mean, as long as we don't, I mean, or rather, let me rephrase that and say, even if we had a world government that had a say over communications on a global level, we could never ever control communications in any way. And we talked about, in our last cloud debate, we talked about ideas around the internet and the dark web, for example, and these uncontrollable spheres of the internet, for example. So it's all of these things it's important that we remember that. So the only thing that we can do is, as Kerry says, make sure that as communicators, we are the ones that put ourselves as some kind of a guardians of what, you know, the information and the correctness and factfulness of the information that we communicate. And I think this is really, really important. And we're still locked in very much to thinking of communication on a national level or a global level as being communicated by trusted sources or supposedly trusted sources, such as national media houses, for example, or government information and so on. And of course, with sort of infiltration by technology that can artificially create messages or infiltrate organizations to spread falsehoods and so on, it's really, really becomes a very, very difficult world to navigate. And I think, as I, you know, maybe to say it's really difficult. But what we need to understand then is that hopefully we have national media or organizations that can communicate in such a way with their stakeholders that they can put some kind of a stamp of veracity on the messages that they communicate, and that they communicate very clearly, whether it's an organization communicating with their employees or whether it's a national media, then that we are clear on triple checking our information and verifying for people that this is the source that you can go to. Don't just listen to any kind of social media source when it comes to messages around your own health and safety, for example, around the COVID pandemic. Yeah, so a long and quite a fussy answer, but it's a really, really difficult one.
Exactly. And actually, Matthew, I'd like to ask you to build on what Ilva's just been saying, because Ilva, what you've been saying has been raised as a question by Sean. He is saying, let's move the conversation a little bit from the bigger organizational level more to the face-to-face communication that employees have in an organization. And how's that being changed by the fourth industrial revolution? And with this is the question of how people are communicating in this lockdown, where we're sort of in a 4IR amplified kind of environment, and the communication that we do between co-workers and colleagues, etc. And I wonder if you think 4IR is able to bridge the face-to-face gap in different ways.
Look, I think that fundamentally humans crave real connection. I think that there was a few points kind of in the beginning of this conversation around, I guess, tech facilitating, and it's this idea of there needs to be a certain level of pragmatism about how we use tech, and how it becomes a tool for our very, I guess, human creative need. So I don't think that we will ever replace one-on-one connection. I think it's a tool, and I think that it is a way for us to really communicate the facts, the pragmatism. But there's a lot of body language, there's a lot of inference that technology will never be able to replicate. There is meaning, there is tonality, there is so many dynamics at play that I think that it's not so simple as, okay, this technology for this purpose. I think its purpose is to ultimately aid us. And I think where it doesn't, we will innovate, because I think that's fundamentally human. I think there's two things that make us human, from my point of view, that really separates us, and that's our ability to communicate with each other effectively and our ability to create, our creative spirit. And when those two things come together, that's what makes us. And I think that in this world of kind of misinformation and a plethora of technologies, where it no longer serves the purpose for which it was intended, we will always circle back to our fundamental human need to connect.
So somebody was saying we are living in our cocoons through 4IR and COVID-19, and you're kind of reassuring us that actually we will get out of these cocoons and be connecting once again. Karabo, there's been quite a lot of chat in the Zoom chat group, and please do contribute to these. We'd love to have your questions. And this chat has really been about this question of connection. Those people who can be connected, have connectivity in the 4IR world are really in the minority. And we're creating new social divisions based around 4IR and technology. And there are quite a few questions here asking, can we elaborate on this a little bit more? And how do you as a panel all think that we can overcome some of these challenges?
So I think one of the biggest lessons for governments, institutions, organizations, and us as individuals is the lesson that inequality is not anecdotal. It's very real. And it's unfortunate that it's taken the worst of the worst and the most downtrodden, even getting into even worse circumstances for people to, and not just people, organizations, even governments have said, we always knew there was inequality, but we didn't think it was this bad. Which means for a long time, our positions of privilege in terms of messaging and communication have allowed us to drown out the voices of people who've been trying to shout for a space, for recognition, for help. And finally, it's taken a tiny little microscopic virus to show it. And unfortunately, also a big loss of human life for people to go, well, this is a really real thing. People are really poor. People really don't have food. People really don't have airtime to buy data, to be able to send a single email. The economics of being connected are no longer, I think, being taken for granted. And I think I count that as a first win in building recognition for the fact that inequalities exist and that 4IR has actually deepened them, because we've simply assumed those who are connected online, that those who are not connected will catch up. But we've never created.
Sorry, someone's saying, I just needed to bring this in, because someone's saying connection should be a human right. And continue, Karabo.
It is, and it's part of the World Health Organization declared it a couple of years ago that it should fundamentally be a human right, and internet connectivity and technological connectivity, because of the way our world is wired, should be a human right. But as we know, what we know to be human rights are often violated, and it stems from power inequalities that result in socioeconomic inequalities, systemic inequalities. But I think this type of moment, and you look at, for example, I read an article about our health minister and the things he worries about and is concerned about and what his team is doing. Finally, government is thinking about the unconnected. Finally, organizations are thinking about who have we been having a relationship with online if we can't reach the people. Because suddenly our operations are not doing well. We're either forced with having to close down, with having to relook and reorganize, re-strategize, rethink. I think what those assumed relationships were, finally this has made everyone pause and stop and evaluate. And I think it's also a good segue now to rethink and take the opportunity to restructure within the chaos in a way that is more inclusive. So learning and switching to online learning has literally still left out a significant section of students, a lot of them, who are barely hanging in there and barely online. How do we switch to, for our context, a mobile first driven consumption of academic content? Do we switch to a mode where there is access to digital, if not necessarily online? How do we use the tools and not necessarily have to force people to also be consuming in the way we want to communicate and we want them to consume? Because that's how we deepen the inequalities. And more about looking at how are they doing it, and where do we find a way to intersect with where they are and use the tools and the technology to enable and to enhance those relationships.
So Ilma, I'd like you to build on what Karabo's been saying, but in the context of a number of questions that we've been getting around, do we think that communication habits will be changing post this COVID? or in for IR? And do we see any business opportunities that could be emerging in this new environment, particularly around communication?
I think it depends on a lot of things. I mean, firstly, I think one should be very clear on, I think that there's no such thing as post-COVID to a certain degree. You know, the world has changed full stop, and we move along with it in various ways. And there are a lot of things that is changing us as we go forth. And I think that what we've seen, and this comes back to what Karabo was talking about the unequalness in our societies, and that is on a global level as well as on a national level for us here in South Africa, where we realize that people actually don't have access, and we put a lot of faith in technology, but it isn't as easy as that. And I think that it showed even just to have access to social grants. People don't have that. You can't, then have a phone number where you're going to phone in, or a link you should access online to access your social grant. It simply doesn't work like that. So we need to find other ways of reaching out to people. And I think so that's one thing. So that's what Karabo was talking about as well, and adapt technology and how we do that in ways that are innovative and clever, so that we can really have an inclusive economy, but also an inclusive technology economy. And that is sort of the political economy then of communications that we're talking about. I think on a human level, I think we've learned a lot of lessons. It's interesting to see that we all of a sudden talking about screen fatigue in a different way. Hey, we are, and it's interesting because these working virtually, like we are doing now, talking to each other, is exhausting. It's a very intimate space. It's actually more intimate than when we sit around a table in a boardroom talking to each other, because it's very intense. We're looking straight at each other. We are very, yet there's a dissonance here, a cognitive dissonance that people have been talking to, that, deceptively close, but still we are very, very isolated. Once the screen closes down, you're no longer there. I can't physically reach out and touch you. And I think that's something that we need to, I think that as communications scholars, researchers, we will have to battle with that. But it's also something that I think that people who do cognitive behavioral science and psychology and so on will have to battle with and come to terms with. So there's a whole new research area that's emerged.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kerry, I'd like to move the conversation to you. You have talked about and written about the ethics of communication, and you were beginning to unpack some of that. And I wonder if you would like to pick up on this conversation about ethics, the ethics of what is asked of us when we are expected to be communicating in these virtual spaces all the time, or possibly the ethics of those who can and can't be connected. In South Africa, for example, one of our big challenges is that in COVID-19, we've people who are working incredibly hard because they have access to technology, and then other members within the same organization who don't have the same access to technology, not able to work, although they would very much like to be part of what's going on. And there's almost a discrimination in the workplace around the access to technology that you have and how good the computer is.
I mean, I would agree with that. We've seen a similar pattern emerge in the UK. I mean, as an aside, even down to obviously the schools closing, some of the schools, the state schools and also the private schools, retooling very quickly, remodeling, putting the work online portals that, the kids are supposed to be homeschooled, and obviously they can drop into a few live lessons. That's really shown that actually many of us take it as a given in this day and age with some of the tech and the kits, which, by UK standards is very expensive to some, but to the masses actually it's not. There is still, many young people that don't have access to tech and kits. So, as an aside, the government here made a commitment to get that tech and kit to every single child that needed it to continue its education, which has hit a few bumps in the road in the system, obviously deploying it, but that's working its way through. So, fingers crossed there in a sense. And, I do think, as communicators, we are in that privileged position where we do have the kit. But, as Caribou's quite rightly said, we just cannot assume that all the time with the people, that either we're working with directly or indirectly. So I think what I'm seeing and what concerns me going forwards is, many companies, businesses, governments, even the UK government, many office-based staff, even though we had an agile approach to working previously, a lot of the PR agencies have an agile approach. You come and go as it suits you, but as long as the job's done, but you need that visibility, you're coming a few times a week to meetings or client talks, presentations, etc. Is most won't go back for 2020. 2021 is questionable if we get a second wave. And my concern about the equality thing is, whilst it's, okay for me, I've got a table, a desk that I can work at quite comfortably. If I get a bit bored or tired there, I can possibly go and sit somewhere else. It might not meet health and safety guidelines. But even on my teams, I've had some, quite worrying conversations, with people, because within 48 hours, UK government has basically retooled, remodel, all go home, all connect from home or wherever you're going to be working from safely, and quite rightly so. But I've got some younger people in my team that are like, oh my God, I'm working out of, a one-bedroom shoebox. I don't have a garden. I'm living in, the most darkest of places. We're all talking about health and well-being. Please make sure you leave your screens, go and have a walk outside, go and have a walk in the garden. And actually, some people don't have that. And again, sometimes as human beings, we sometimes do assume that people have that. So I think that's going to be a bit of an issue going forward. And also, sort of on the back of that is the whole health and well-being issues that we may start to see crop up. I mean, it has been a tough 3 months. The pace is not going to stop going forwards. Organisations, businesses are absolutely going to accelerate going forwards now. Obviously, demands will stay the same, particularly as everyone in IC, communications, PR, marketing teams have absolutely had to work at full pelt, faster than they've ever worked before. Just a bit of colour, a bit of sentiment. In UK government, we used to turn around policies for key announcements. Could take 6 months to and froing. It now takes hours, if not days. So it shows that when they want to do it, they can do it. However, we will see that going forward. So I think the whole equality issue is of paramount. Obviously, that links into another topic of inclusion, which again is absolutely paramount. We have to absolutely bang the drum for genuine inclusion every single point we can. Diversity. I was going to say, diversity in all ways. It can never be a tick box exercise of, upping up numbers of different races and, all different parts that make up that whole, diversity strand. If we don't have full inclusion, and that again goes back to what Caribou's saying, we just can't take it as a given. So I think, as well as societal issues that we've got to address, we've also got, quite stark issues to address within our own teams as well.
Yeah.
And that obviously is well-being, mental health.
Great. Thank you, Kerry. We've just got a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask Matthew and Ilva and Karabo for some last thoughts that you have, just within a minute, to kind of wrap up your ideas and your takeaway to our audience. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. So I think some great discussions, and I think what's really quite heartwarming to me is how much of the humanness has come out of this discussion, and my genuine concern about what does this do to creativity? How do we look after each other, both from infrastructure to connectivity to how do we actually just care for each other? And fundamentally, for me, that is what communication is about. How do we connect with each other, and how do we make sure that nobody's left out? So for me, that's really encouraging as a kind of final thought.
Lovely. Thank you, Matthew. And Ilva?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's spot on, and we the previous speakers have put it very clearly. It is about equality and finding then how do we provide access and inclusivity for everyone in this new comm space, and we've discussed that a lot. And it's about how we put people first, which is also comes out of that, and finding then innovative ways of using technology to do so. I think those will be my parting words. Yeah.
Wonderful. And Karabo?
So my thing is, and I love what Kerry said, we finally know that governments can really do a lot in a short amount of time with the right, shall we call it, information. But that energy needs to be channeled into building inclusive spaces to allow everybody to participate meaningfully in a way that protects their dignity as well as enhances our relationships with people and balances the powers a little bit more as we work with each other, as we communicate with one another, and as we drive these relationships and the human connectedness that both Matt and Ilva speak to.
For me, one of the takeaways of our discussion goes back to one of the questions I asked right at the beginning. How do you know when it's some AI algorithm that's communicating with you or whether it's a human? And I think for me, the thing that's come out of today's conversation is how much humanity, the care of people, the importance of being together is really at the heart of communications. And so possibly one of the ways that we can tell whether it is the human or an algorithm is just in the human connectivity, that sense of being heard and understood that comes through some communications but doesn't come through other communications. It's been really wonderful to share this hour with you and to share this very stimulating conversation. I wish we had more than an hour, because I think there's so much more that we could have unpacked. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the next debate with you in a few weeks' time. Thank you to Kerry and to Matt and to Ilva and to Karabo. You've been a wonderful panel and you've made my job so easy, and I've really enjoyed the hour that we've spent together. Thank you all very much. Stay well and stay safe.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.